The real reason for Republicans' silence on Donald Trump, speculates the editorial board in the New York Times today. Over at the Washington Post, the Morning Plum is talking about the supposed showdown between populist economic nationalism on one side and limited government conservatism, free trade, and internationalism on the other. This would be the war within the Republican Party. But what they're suggesting is that this is really about autocracy. It's really about, being the big tough guy, be the authoritarian. In fact, the title of it by Greg Sargent is The Trump Authoritarian Cult. But there's not just the authoritarian cult. We talked about that at some length yesterday, actually, talking about the Marburg speech and whatnot. But this piece by the editorial board in today's New York Times is extraordinary. I keep talking about how our media, our for-profit, corporate, largely consolidated and monopolized media, cover only 2 out of the 3 aspects of news. One aspect of news is drama, right? If you show up at the crash, you show up at 9/11 and you stick a microphone in some poor widow or widower's face and say, how do you feel, right? There's drama. That's part of news. And then there's the sports part of news. Who's winning, who's losing, all right? Again, 9/11. Hey, are the terrorists ahead of us? Are we behind? Are we ahead of them? What politician is going to make the most out of this? How's it going to play? Part of that is drama. Part of it is sports. But then the third part of news is the facts, the actual details of what's going on. And our news media has largely decided to sacrifice facts. For example, the night before last, the Senate at 10 o'clock at night had this vote to prevent you and me from engaging in class action lawsuits against banks. And, well, not just banks, by the way, it goes way beyond that, but the bankers were the ones who were particularly flipped out about it. So, if Wells Fargo, right now, if Wells Fargo opens an account without telling you and does that to, say, 1 million people and makes $10 a month off it for a year, that's $120 that you spent that you didn't know was being taken out of your account. You got ripped off to the tune of $120 in this example. And it's a hypothetical, but, for example. Now, but you're not going to hire a lawyer for $120. But if 1 million people got screwed by Wells Fargo, then, a lawyer could sue Wells Fargo for that $120 million on behalf of all that million people and then distribute the 120 to each one of them. And now you've got an actual lawsuit, right? Well, the House has already voted on this. The Senate voted on it night before last to make that illegal, to make it illegal for you to exercise your 7th Amendment rights if your bank was able to force you, and make no mistake about it, there's an element of coercion here, into signing an agreement with a forced arbitration clause in it, into signing a mortgage, into signing a credit card agreement, into signing a line of credit with forced arbitration built into it, whatever it may be. Sorry, you can tell Blue's in the studio today. And so what is it that the Republican Party is actually up to? What the Republican Party is up to is basically devastating the American middle class, the American working class, the American biosphere, our air, our water, our food supply, devastating all those things in exchange for more profit for corporations, more tax breaks for billionaires, more money for the very wealthy, the people who own the Republican Party. And the New York Times today put together a pretty good list of it. And I'm curious, if you were to put together a list, what are the things that the Republicans are doing right now that concern you the most? Right, the thing that, frankly, that concerns me the most, and I'm going to share with you parts of this New York Times list, but I think that most of this falls under a larger category, and that is politicians who are owned by wealthy people or by industries. When you have politicians that are owned by billionaires or by industries, then those politicians are not going to do the interest of the American people. They're not going to do what you need to have done. They're not going to do what I need to have done. They're not going to do what the average American needs to have done. They're going to do what needs to be what the billionaires and the big corporations want. And they are. As the New York Times points out, this is the real reason why Republicans are not taking on Donald Trump, because he's actually getting stuff done for them. And this is by the editorial board, by the way. This is not an individual liberal at the New York Times. You've got conservatives, you've got liberals, you've got the whole spectrum in the editorial board of the New York Times. And when they achieve a consensus, it's an amazing thing. And here it is. On Tuesday night, the Senate, with a tie-breaking vote from Vice President Mike Pence, followed the House in voting to overturn a rule that would have allowed consumers to file class action lawsuits against banks and other financial institutions rather than be forced to take their disputes to arbitration. So that's one I already shared with you. Number two, Mr. Trump signed an executive order allowing insurers to sell skimpy health insurance plans that do not protect people with pre-existing conditions and that will destabilize the Affordable Care Act's marketplaces. He also said he'd stop making payments to insurers that were authorized in the 2010 law that will cause companies to increase premiums, hurting middle-class families. His administration shortened the open enrollment period when people can buy insurance policies for next year and slash spending on advertising and outreach efforts. This is just like bullet point, step by step by step. Here's the stuff that Trump is doing to screw you, to screw the average Americans and to benefit the billionaires who don't want to be paying that 3.9% additional tax on capital gains to fund Obamacare. Environmental harm. Here's what the Trump administration is doing right now to help the billionaires who own polluting factories while they're hurting you. Congress overturned a rule restricting the ability of coal companies to dump their mining debris into streams and other waterways, threatening rural communities, forests, and wildlife, writes the editorial board of the New York Times. And then they take on Scott Pruitt, pointing out that he rejected a staff recommendation to ban the pesticide chlorpyrifos, if I'm saying that right, which has been linked to developmental problems in children, and started the process to overturn the Clean Power Plan, the Obama-era proposal to reduce planet-warming emissions from power plants. So you've got Scott Pruitt over at the EPA doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. Hurting workers. Congress repealed an Obama-era rule that would have required companies seeking federal contracts of $500,000 or more to disclose and fix serious labor and safety violations. You get this? The Republicans actually passed a law saying that if your company is bidding for federal jobs and you have serious labor and safety violations in the workplace, that's just fine. You don't have to correct those. You aren't banned from getting a federal contract. You don't have to fix the workplace. It used to be that employers were required to keep 5 years' worth of records of on-the-job injuries. They couldn't hide that information. The Republicans said, nah, you can hide the information now. It's amazing. The Education Department has delayed implementation of an Obama-era rule to ensure that for-profit colleges were preparing students for good jobs. Now you can just run a scam college, right? No standards, no regulations. They want to make it harder for state and local governments to create retirement accounts for workers whose employers didn't provide for 401ks. Making housing less affordable, helping big corporations, putting lives at risk. I mean, these are the categories. I haven't gone through all the details yet. It's amazing.